actually, we should probably set the background for non-80s and 90s kids listening. Calvin and Hobbes was a comic strip that was created by cartoonist Bill Watterson. It was syndicated from November 18th, 1985 to December 31st, 1995. At the height of its popularity, Calvin and Hobbes was featured in over 2,400 newspapers worldwide. Calvin and Hobbes books have sold 45 million copies worldwide. The strip revolves around a 6-year-old boy named Calvin and his stuffed tiger, Hobbes. But is Hobbes just a stuffed tiger, or is he a sentient creature, or an aspect of Calvin's imagination, or Calvin's literal spirit animal, or a manifestation of Calvin's id, and or spirit, or all of the above? More on that later. The story of Calvin and Hobbes is fascinating, partly because the creator is a bit of a J.D. Salinger figure. Created his art, walked away, a creative genius that made a body of work that is beloved, but then has not done anything since, almost 3 decades at this point. But the why of why we're doing this episode is also because I would argue that Calvin and Hobbes had an almost spiritual, philosophical role in shaping Gen Xers and how we think of the world. Do you agree with that, Daniel? What's your background with Calvin and Hobbes?
I mean, I completely agree about its influence. I think that it's pretty inarguable whenever you speak to somebody who has a relationship with it. I think if you've heard of it, you love it. It's one of those bodies of work where it's pretty much universally beloved by anybody who's encountered it. You get people who are contrarians about, like, the Beatles, or contrarians about The Simpsons, or, other long-running institutions like Saturday Night Live, where you can kind of chart their ups and downs. I think Calvin and Hobbes is one of the very few sort of, like, consensus choices of a perfect thing to be created in society. I don't know of anybody who's like, yeah, I've read all of it, B-.
And it tailed off at the end. It was great at the beginning, but I feel like it was also consistent all the way through.
Right, exactly. And as an elder millennial who badly wanted to be in Gen X, was just scratching at the dog door of Gen X. This was seminal for me. I write comics, and newspapers, for people who weren't familiar, are it was like a TikTok made of trees. They used to come to your house every morning.
You know what? I was afraid to do this because it would be reductive or insulting, but like. There were once things called newspapers, but I mean, like, seriously, my background with it is, like, this was a routine part of my day growing up. Like, you come down for breakfast, pour a bowl of Cheerios, and the newspaper's on the table, and your dad is maybe reading the news section, and later on in my teen years, maybe I would go to the sports section first. But from the time I could read, my brother and I would pass the comics pages back and forth. That was for us. And if you're 7 or 8 and there's this one strip that jumps out at you that really speaks to you, it was Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, it did an incredible job of reaching you without talking down to you. And I think that that's sort of one of the cornerstones of its appeal, then and enduring, was that it was so unflinchingly honest about what it felt like to be a child, that it allowed kids to acknowledge their own cynicism and dissatisfaction and ambition in a way that I think was really rare in children's media, which, especially at the time, was largely made by adults who had forgotten what it felt like to be kids and were marketing to a version of kids that they'd created in their heads.
Well, and I don't know if you got this sense too, but like, a lot of the other comics like Peanuts, like Family Circus, like Beetle Bailey or the Lockhorns or something like that, were clearly from a different generation. And, that's not true for everything. Like Garfield was, contemporaneous. Kathy, for better or for worse. Is it for better or worse? Yeah. And especially like the Far Side. So there were things that felt of a time, but like half the comics page, you sort of got the sense that, oh, this was written by people that maybe wrote jokes for comics in the 50s or something.
Right. Yeah, it definitely was, new and fresh. And one of the things that I think makes it sort of an underreported tentpole of the Gen X kind of pop culture pantheon and mentality is that sort of like, it's a fresh look at something that has so long been dominated by a previous generation. You know, it's a rejection of the premise, the same way that a lot of the music was, a lot of the movies was. You know, this is work that is created by people who have seen all of those movies and listened to all of that music and are acknowledging that it exists, instead of sort of continuing in the same track that kind of, you know, is in a parallel universe. Like, it's a comic strip that felt like things that were happening in real life. I think Peanuts is the only thing comparable.
Right.
You know, Peanuts was allowed to introduce cynicism into monoculture, but it was, as you're saying, very much the product of a different generation.